Hi, I'm Don Dodge, and this is Google Root Access. Today we're going to talk about open source, and specifically how startups can use open source to build their business. My guest today is Chris DiBona. Chris runs the open source programs for Google. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Don.
So tell me a little bit about, you've been involved in open source for a long, long time. So tell me a little bit about what you do.
I look after open source for Google, and we've talked about that in a previous show. But I've also been just involved in companies that use open source since 1994, I guess. Is when I first was exposed to it personally and started bringing it into my work.
Well, you advise startups.
I do.
You invest in startups.
I do.
You work with Google Ventures.
I do. Yeah. So I've been doing that for probably about 9 years, 10 years. I had to start it myself. It failed miserably, so maybe you shouldn't take my advice. But yeah. So, and obviously, when people want to talk to me, it's oftentimes about how to use open source software and how to use that in a developer ecosystem, how to reach developers, and that kind of thing.
So let's give people a little free advice here.
Okay.
How can startups best use open source?
Well, first of all, if they're not using open source, I would probably not advise them. I mean, and not because that's all I'm good at, but because I don't have a lot of respect for people who want to reinvent the wheel that much. Starting from scratch on software seems very broken to me. When you can start with, look at the sort of the Ruby on Rails revolution, all those web startups that came out of that. They didn't have to start with Rails. They could have just written a bunch of PHP and started from scratch with their own templating and their own database access libraries, but they used Ruby on Rails. Why? Because it made things really, really, really easy, and they could be creative on top of it first, instead of having to build all these fundamentals and then be creative and try to attract a user base and the rest. So when I talk to startups, it's because they want to continue to use open source software in an effective way, or they're at the point where they want to release their own software or bring developers into their ecosystem. And that's when I end up talking to people.
So you mentioned Ruby on Rails. That's interesting. What are some of the other foundational kinds of open source that startups should consider?
Well, it depends on when in time, when in the dusty annals of time we're talking about. Because there are times when people were making the big jump over to open source databases, open source operating systems, open source languages, open source frameworks like Rails, and open source scripting approaches. There's so many things that you would slap the open source label onto and either use or learn from or whatever. And it's just vast. It's like saying, which drop of this ocean would you like to speak about? It's really interesting. When people decide to start releasing and trying to drive, frankly, the direction of an open source project from inside a startup or from inside a company, that's also something that I'm pretty good at, and I've been doing for a long time. When I was at VA Linux and VA Research, and now at Google, it's a fundamental part of what I do is how do we drive developer desire and developer productivity towards these platforms and ecosystems around open source.
So lots of startups use Hadoop. I talked to one yesterday that uses Freebase. There's MongoDB.
Sure.
There's
Redis and LevelDB.
So what are some of the decisions you would make on which way to go using some of these things?
So I usually start with sort of the basics of what's important to the company now and in the near future. I don't want to sound too conservative here, but a lot of times people want to put the scaling cart before the user horse, and they don't really think through, okay, I have to have users before I worry about scaling to millions of them. Or they want to plan ahead for scaling that will never ever happen, or they don't really understand a lot of the tools that are out there that have been around for a while, things like MySQL and Postgres. You can scale them fairly dramatically on modern hardware before you're ever going to see any sort of blips that would even require you to go to a master-slave relationship, much less to a NoSQL style database where you're going to lose a lot of functionality in return for what you think is scaling.
And most startups never get to those scaling issues.
Well, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but yeah, most startups have a really hard time attracting users, much less scaling the users they have. That said, you don't want to plan for, failure, right? You want to plan for, awesomeness, and hypergrowth, right? And so there are some things you can do in the very beginning to do that. Like you can ensure that, your database queries are a certain kind and aren't too many left-handed joins or whatever. But it really comes down to understanding the fundamentals that underpin your system. It's funny because, a lot of people talk about Twitter scaling problems in the early days. But if you think about it, they scaled as well as they needed to grow very quickly, right? We made jokes about fail whales, but you know what? People were seeing them, and that meant that people were using the hell out of that thing, right? So, yeah, it's embarrassing to show that underbelly of your company that you failed to scale today, right? But at the same time, it's good that you have that problem. It's sort of the long and short of it. And the reality is by the time that you have that problem, there are people that we know that we can bring in and say, okay, you want to scale MySQL for reals, you want to scale Apache for reals, you want to start using Memcached for reals, well, here's who we're going to talk to, and here's who you're going to want to have come in, or here's the kind of software you're going to bring into the company to make it scale better. And then, it's funny because if you look at Wikipedia and LiveJournal and how they scaled, it's extremely instructive. And it's actually fairly shocking how many people never really looked at how these sites scaled and instead went this other direction, which was incredibly compute intensive and CPU intensive and machine intensive, when they could have just been much more aggressive about caching. But people failed to understand how little their databases are changing from user view to user view, for instance, and how aggressively caches can reduce the draw on your machinery. And then you get into these side conversations. Well, what happens when the cache is empty and you need to fill it? And how can you pre-fill caches? So we can have all these discussions. But, it's pretty surprising to me how little people have learned from the scaling lessons of the past. And I'm not even talking about the slash dots in circa 2000 or circa 2001. I'm talking about things that have happened in the last couple of years. And how little they've learned about some of the cloud providers and their I/O performance. And
where are these lessons?
They're hard to find. There are certain conferences I think that are better than others at exposing them. But the thing is, if you go to YouTube and you type in scaling my favorite website, whether your favorite website is Twitter or Google or whatever, there's somebody who's given a talk at a Google I/O or an OSCON or whatever about exactly that topic. Spend the 45 minutes during your lunch hour, eat at your desk, whatever, and learn. There's so many great lessons that are just waiting there on YouTube. Really, this you don't even have to go to a special website. You can just go right there and just type in scaling Twitter, scaling this, and you'll see people talking about exactly what they encountered and what they experienced and how they did it. You could say, suppose you're using Rails, you could say scaling Rails. Suppose you're using Drupal, scaling Drupal. You'll find these lessons. They're out there. You don't need a guy like me. You don't need Brian Aker. You don't need to go pay guys like that to, even though they're great, to go and learn these things. But they've already told you, over
so just
and
a
over
Google
and over
search or YouTube search on scaling Drupal or scaling.
And often, the code is right there. You can copy it. It's open source. You can bring it over. I think Brian Fitzpatrick. Sorry, we joke about the wrong Fitz inside the company. Brad Fitzpatrick, who wrote LiveJournal and then Memcached. He's given the scaling Memcached and advances in Memcached talk at OSCON. I think he gave it for 5 years. And the content certainly changed and updated, and it's different now than it was the last time he gave it, but not fundamentally. The lessons are all there for you to learn, and it doesn't take a lot of time to learn it. You can turn around in an hour from right now. You can shut off this podcast.
Please don't.
Don't. But and you can learn enough to scale 2x, 10x, 100x the performance of MySQL, the performance of Apache, the performance of Memcached, the performance of Rails. And we're talking in an hour. This is not a huge amount of time. You would have spent that long watching, you're rewatching House of Cards on Netflix,
So literally, you can find some experts giving talks on scaling issues or using open source issues on YouTube or Google.
Exactly. And you owe it to yourself to do that if you're in a startup, because startups, you have all the great problems. You have the problems of getting users. Once you get the users, and there's lots of talks about getting users. I think you've given a talk on how to become a startup. It's like, getting the users, serving the users, and then even, monetizing, advertising.
Yep.
Everything is out there. And it's, honestly, when I did my startup, I failed at it. I should just point out, this is the one I failed at. It didn't fail because of scaling. It didn't fail because of even attracting a potential user base. I had 25,000 people who would have paid me as soon as we launched. It was failure to launch. It was failure to execute internally. And you know, so there's ample opportunities to fail independent of this knowledge, but there's so much knowledge out there now, you know, so yeah.
Let's talk about tools that are available to help you manage your code or
Sure.
manage open source and merging it with your proprietary code.
Okay. So we had talked earlier about segregation of code so that you know what you're using and how you're using it. There's tooling out there that'll help you track open source code and the rest, but honestly, there's not a lot you have to worry about there. You know, if you're shipping software, like you're writing an iOS app or an Android Play app, you know, you'll want to be a little more careful about the GPLs and the share-alike licenses if you're not ready to share your code. But you know, as far as tooling goes, you know, GitHub, code.google.com, you know, they're out there to help you share and interact with these outside communities already. So what sort of tooling do you mean, Don?
Well, for example, I've heard of startups that when they were in the process of being acquired, discovered open source code they didn't even know they had.
Yeah.
Because some random developer employees put open source code in there and didn't tell them about it, and they didn't discover it until later.
Yeah, and that tends to slow down acquisitions and exits and the rest. So, you know, again, just tell your engineers, and I've told tons of engineers this in the companies I've advised. It's real simple. If you bring software into the company, if you're not being creative in your brain and typing it into the computer, you know, put it in a third-party directory. You know, think about where that code is coming from, and just keep it separate. And then that's really all you need. You know, if you're the kind of company that ships software, well, you're going to care about, you know, if you're using a share-alike license. If you're the kind of company that ships on the web, you're going to care about the ones that really sort of want you to pay instead of doing that, you know, the AGPLs. So just a little bit of foresight. And
but in the early days,
trouble.
In the early days of a startup, you know, when you're just 8 or 10 guys hacking away and building code, and you're not really paying attention to having nice, tidy code repositories and keeping track of where you picked up open source code and that kind of stuff. So
that does happen, or they're not as complete as we would want them to be in our part of the world, and that happens. So the problem is, it's like everything in development. You can do it now, or you can do it later. If you do it later, it's going to take you 10, 100 times as much as work, you know, to do. So to pull out a piece of software that is running inside your service before you are acquired by another company is going to take a vast amount of work to replicate, you know. So you can do a couple of things right now as a software developer. You just get in the habit of dropping third-party code in a third-party directory. You can get into the habit of just thinking through where code comes from. You can get the habit, frankly, of learning from places instead of just copying the code if there's no license apparent, you know, as opposed to later having to pull it out. I've had to go back on acquisitions and say, okay, if you want to be purchased by us, before we can give you money or before you can hit a milestone, you have to do X and Y and Z. And the look on actually the non-engineer faces, this is always pretty entertaining, but the engineers are like, okay, how am I going to do this? Okay. And it's usually actually really easy to do. It's not hard, you know, because usually with most open source packages, you know, you're putting them separate anyway, and then you're calling them in certain ways, you know, or they're designed in such a way that your code is very clearly delineated from their code. But yeah, sometimes people are like, wait, we could delay our acquisition because of this. We could delay our exit because of this. And it's like, yeah, you know, because we have to respect these people, you know, who have been so generous as to give their time and code to you. All we have to do is be a little courteous, you know, and that's the right thing to do.
So there are tools like Black Duck software.
Black Duck, Palamita, there's Open Logic, which is a nonprofit, yeah.
So these tools will review your source code and find where there are open source segments and tell you what licenses you need to do. So there are simple tools out there that can help you.
There's some very simple tools out there. And you know, we don't use Black Duck here, Palamita here. It's just, we're a search company. We're good at that kind of thing. You know, they're fine, you know. Honestly, we've gotten to the point now at Google, at least, if we see the nature of your startup, I can tell you what software they're using. It's video startups use FFmpeg. They use, some of these other libraries. If you're some consumer, communications app, I know what libraries you're using. It's just, and it's not just me. There's plenty of people like me who are like, okay, you're like this. Or you could just buy that expertise, from the Palomitas and the Black Ducks and the rest.
So let's talk about another part of it. Is it viable, or is it reasonable for a startup to build a viable open source community?
So yes and no. What we see more often is an open source community that becomes a startup. You saw this. I think actually Mongo started this way. I know that Drupal did in Acquia, which is the Drupal commercialization company. Joomla was a little bit of both. I think they started it. They wanted to do a CMS, but they knew that to compete in that market, they had to be open source. So it just depends. But yeah, I think fundamental to having a developer ecosystem around your product, whether it's open source or not, you're going to be using open source examples. If you look at how Google does it, and we've done it since the very beginning, when we release an example of code, when you see a piece of code in a Google blog, like a Google Coder blog, you know that license is there. Even if it's just a snippet, we say snippets are licensed under the Apache license, text is licensed under Creative Commons Share Alike 3.0, right? We say this at the bottom of every blog, and we say this in the about boxes. We say this, all over the place, because we want to have the right relationship with our developers. I'm going to say, if you have this software, here is the deal. And I have to be honest with you, one of the things that's been happening lately around hackathons and the rest, they say, if you take part in this hackathon, you're giving us all of your patents, all the work you're doing, all the copyright, and the right to use you in our marketing, da-da-da-da. And it's actually deeply unfair.
That sounds kind of scary.
It is scary. It should really make people pause and wait and look at them. Because, it's come down to, there are some, like Googlers want to do these hacker cups and hackathons sometimes, and I have to tell them no in some of these cases, unless they change the terms of the contest. And what's funny about contests and the way contest law works in the United States, if you structure it as a contest, you have to give the same rules to everybody who takes part in it. So you can't fix it after the fact. You have to fix it before the contest starts and before people start registering for this contest, right? So it's really a place where every once in a while the rapaciousness of the industry will pop its head up and say, hey, I'm over here. And you have to sort of have a real eagle eye towards that. Because, people think nothing of joining these hackathons. And so what I try to do on Google's side is make sure that ours don't have those kinds of stanzas in their terms and conditions. And
so if I'm a hacker and I want to participate in a hackathon,
right.
What do I need to look out for? I've never seen this.
Look out for terms in the terms and services of the hackathon that say all the work of all participants in this hackathon become the property of, or are given an exclusive and sometimes even non-exclusive right to all patents and copyright and all the rest. And,
wow.
Because you've seen these sorts of agreements happen when people try to do deals with big companies, right? It's like sometimes you just have to take it, right, and just stick with it. But most of the time, you should be controlling your destiny a little more carefully than that. And on behalf of our employees, I have to. So sometimes I have to give the bad news that they can't take part, which I hate doing because I don't want to tell somebody, that thing you think is for fun and for good and just, computer science. It's not. It's just nasty.
Interesting. I had never heard that before.
Yeah. So that's something that's actually been an emerging issue lately, because hackathons have gotten super popular over the last year. And yeah.
Interesting. Another recent issue. I read a story this morning about crowdfunding of open source projects.
Yeah.
So sort of like Kickstarter for capital applied to open source projects. And it sort of blew my mind. I had not seen that before.
Yeah. So we have. In this world of open source, back in 1997, there was a company called Source Exchange that tried this, where basically they would have bug bounties that would be directed towards specific improvements on open source software. And then CollabNet, this was their initial business model before they switched over to version control and the rest. And then half a dozen since then, And I don't want to sound negative on the idea, but by the time open source wants capital, wants money to drive development, they either form a company, the way that Acquia is for Drupal or whatever, or companies will hire developers directly to contribute. I haven't seen crowdfunding that works for open source yet. And if you say, well, what about the Ouya and what about this? I would say, well, those are actually hardcore products and they're using open source, but they're not really contributing to open source. Or you say there's a recent iteration of PyDev for instance, and he's like, if I get money, I'll do this and this and this. And he says if he hits a certain threshold, he'll make it open source. And it's like, well, that doesn't sound like open source to me. That sounds like, you're funding the development of a specific kind of development tool, and maybe it'll be open source if he hits 250,000. It's like, so you hit these sort of like, open source is just the sugar on the cake. It's just the syntactic sugar, as it were. But it's not what it is. And then I guess we had talked about this earlier, and you had mentioned that there was like an equity stake that was also going to be proposed.
Yes.
And I have to be honest with you, as somebody involved in startups, I can't see wanting to dilute across 10,000 people, an equity stake. I just, people forget, and I know the Jobs Act changed a lot of things, but the fundamental difficulty of having a lot of stakeholders is not to be underestimated.
Right.
I mean, there's a reason why companies avoid going public for so long when they're profitable. It's a significant tax on the company to have to report for many, many shareholders. And in fact, it's funny, when people do go public, it's because they have to do that tracking anyways because they have too many shareholders.
That's right.
So, so they might as well go public, and since they're going to be paying the price anyway, right, of having to share all that information. So it's, I'm not as thrilled with the idea. I should read up more on this most recent version of it, but it's tough. So you'll have to convince me that it's going to work where it hasn't worked before, and that the few models that have worked for commercialization of open source communities and open source projects, that they've stopped working somehow.
So I think your point is that if you have a successful open source project that's attracting developers and is becoming successful, then you aren't going to have a problem raising money anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So I've never seen anyone having problems from name VCs, name whatever, getting funding.
And conversely, if you don't have a successful open source project, the chances of raising money through a Kickstarter kind of thing are pretty slim anyway.
Are lower, yes.
Yeah.
Now, what's funny about Kickstarter, and this will sound orthogonal, but it's not, and the success of like self-publishing novels on these digital marketplaces, where basically you're cutting out a middleman.
Right.
So I think that there's probably some knowledge to be gained there. Is there a situation in the realm that we're talking about that looks like the cutting out of a middleman, right? Maybe, but I've always been deeply suspicious of people who want to be the middleman for me to open source. So we've been approached by lots of people say, what we'll do is we'll take Google money and we'll make sure it gets distributed to these program groups or these developers. I'm like, or we can just cut them checks. Why would we let you rip 5, 10%, 30% off the top? To give us the pleasure of funding some organization. So I'm a little skeptical of a Kickstarter model for funding like that. But I'm happy to be wrong. If it creates more open source code, who cares?
So the best advice I heard from you in the past 10 minutes is, if you're a startup that wants to use open source, do a search on Google or YouTube for how to use it or how to scale it. And you can find a lot of great advice. Or
the best warning ever. A lot of people will say, if you do this, you're going to be screwed. Don't do this. And it usually won't affect what you want to do with the software at all. It's just like, if I go down that road, I'm going to have 10 times the queries. So I don't want to do that.
So even great advice is free.
Yeah, it really is. It's better than free. It's really high quality HD streams. From some of the smartest people in development. And you can really, buff up your engineers in ways that sending them to conferences won't do, and sending them,
just watch
to training
YouTube.
and just watch YouTube for a little bit, So watching YouTube parties during lunch or something. I don't know, It's
interesting.
Yeah, so.
Oh, that's another good piece of advice.
Yeah,
if you're a startup, just watch YouTube videos at lunch.
It's really true.
How to do things, and you can learn more than a week at a conference.
Yeah, I would say that's almost certainly true. And conferences are a blast. I love going to conferences. I love speaking at them. Well, most of them, not all of them. We talked about that earlier too, but I won't say that out loud. But you're not going to go to more than 1-2 conferences a year. Because you're murdering a week of your life, and that's 1/52nd of your productive time. And then if you go on a vacation, that's another. So you're just chopping away at the time you have to spend on your life's work. And why would you want to do that? So.
Well, thank you for sharing with us.
Thanks for having me.
This was terrific. Thank you very much.
Good talking to you.
And thank you for joining us on Google Root Access. Join us again next week when we'll talk about a topic of interest to startups. Thank you.